If you haven't looked already on the website, which is massively overhauled, worked very, very hard on it. On the far right, it says ministries. The first drop down says growth groups. Under growth groups, has a list of the growth groups, not all the addresses, but it has a description and the link to the book. And beneath that, in the growth groups, is the recording of everything we've done so far. So, ministries, growth groups, and you'll see it around there. And I say, if you missed one, you want to see what the pastor's been doing or something like that, and it's a link to every one of them. Also, it's on my podcast, but there's all the different ways to get to it. My podcast I don't have a separate church podcast. My personal podcast, it's interspersed with sermon, this, and my own podcast stuff I always do. But if you want just this study, go to the website and go to growth groups.
What's it under? I have a glimpse of.
It's on the main website. At the very right, it says ministries. Well, on your mobile,
On your podcast.
That's Glimpse of the Kingdom.
you glimpse of the kingdom, you just have to scroll up and down until you find the one that says, like How to Read the Bible, Chapter 9, Part 1, or something like that. How to Read the Bible, Chapter 5, Part. But if you want just the How to Read the Bible growth group. And also the Wednesday night study I teach, called Pastor Study, that's also on the website. If you go to, I think it's under Resources. It says Sermons, Pastor Study, Pastor's Blog. If you click Pastor Study, I've recorded everything I've done there on Wednesday nights, and I'll always upload that. So anytime I teach anything, I will always have it updated on the website, and I'll do it on my podcast as well. So hopefully tonight those who have missed can go back and listen. All right, we've covered several things about how to interpret the Bible. Remember, the whole goal is to interpret the Bible well, so we apply it. This isn't just a university. It's not that, believe me, a study of academic, pure cerebral kind of stuff. We're trying to be better disciples. And the first step of any kind of thing, any type of study at all of literature is to ask, what kind of literature is this? We call that genre. And once you figure out what genre is, it goes, oh, I bet there are certain rules that the person who wrote it into that genre intended for us to read it as. So if Sarah writes a cookbook, she's going to assume that the audience will read it with certain lenses so that 350 is not a metaphor. 350 degrees is not a simile, it's not hyperbole, it's just literal, read at face value. But if she wrote a poetry book, she's going to assume the audience knows how to read it as she intended it. And what I've been suggesting, and many specialists suggest, is that the biblical authors did the same thing. They chose genres with the assumption that the audience, typically probably his audience, would know what kind of questions to ask of the text. So therefore, if you follow that logic, most bad theology and bad practice comes from asking the wrong questions of the text. They ask the wrong question of the text because they don't know the genre. And that's why this biblical study, this book on how to read the Bible for all it's worth, separates it according to genre. So again, I'm trying to make it as real we do with comic books, cookbooks, whatever. Same thing. Old Testament narratives are theological histories where we're always asking God as the main character, what's God teaching us, what does it tell us about God, and so forth. And we'll look at characters, all the things we talked about. And the law, remember the law is what God said to those people at that time when God is the main king and the priest rule. And how do we apply it today? Well, we only look for things that are restated or reaffirmed in the New Testament. I'm just and there's all kinds of different laws. We did just a basic overview of those. But remember, the Jews in general thought God's covenant was a good thing. His law was a good thing. That in general, but they weren't trying to earn their marriage. Remember my wedding ring analogy? They were trying to show they're married by obeying the law. The law was just a grace gift to them, and they try their best to obey it. And then we're going to skip ahead to a different genre called the Psalms. So any questions? I'm trying to spike any interested questions, anything you've been mulling over? If not, we'll move ahead. Chapter 11, the Psalms, Israel's prayers and ours. The book of Psalms is an ancient Hebrew hymnal. It has 5 major books. It's really 5 hymnals in one. Volume 1, Volume 2, Volume 3, 4, and 5. Used primarily during acts of public worship. And it is quite difficult, if not impossible, to date when the Psalms are written. And chapters 1 through 41, 42 to 72, 73 to 89, 90 to 106, 107 to 150. And I want to make sure that sinks in. We have hymnals at church. That's a hymn book. The Psalms are their ancient hymnals. If I took those, usually if I'm at church when I'm teaching this, I go grab a hymnal and my Bible. I put the hymnal and I stick them together and go, if I could just shove this inside of here, that's what the Psalms are. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I just had a question based on,
Good question. So were sacrifices at the temple communal or independent or individual? The answer is yes. Yeah, they were typically individual. Let me make one point of clarification. The synagogue was an independent, autonomous, local collection of at least 10 Jewish males who got together to study, learn how to maybe read and write, talk about the weather, teach their kids, maybe do a worship service. It's like a public meeting house for Jews. They were not governed. They were not run by a higher power and bishops and popes and nothing. Independently run. A local teacher could come into town and say, hey, Dennis is in town. Let's have him preach this Sunday or Saturday, right? Let's have him teach. Sure. So Dennis would show up and do the lesson. That was very common. Sacrifices and offerings only occurred at the temple, and that was in Jerusalem. So if you were in Jesus' day, Jerusalem's down south, Galilee's up north. So you go down to Jerusalem. If you were nearby in Judea, that's that region of Jerusalem, then you might be able to make it that same day or 2 days later to go offer a sacrifice offering at the temple. If you were on the outskirts of Israel, and certainly if you live way down in Egypt or way over in Rome or way over in eastern Babylon, you didn't make it much in life at all. Maybe once a lifetime, or maybe if you're close enough during the big high holy days and you make a pilgrimage, Yom Kippur, those kind of like the Hajj in Islam. That's exactly right. So it's a similar analogy. If you can go, you go. But that's one reason why the priests are told in Leviticus to offer sacrifices on behalf of the people. And so they could individually go offer it. In that sense, sacrifices would have been to some degree around the clock, to some degree. I don't know if it happened necessarily at nighttime, but they happen all the time. But they were communal on the high holy days. Then a whole community would get together like a Pesach or Passover, and it would have flooded. And your whole family would go and offer it, or your extended family. Good question. Yeah. And these psalms probably were used at certain times during these high holy days. If you have your Bible, we'll turn to Psalm 1. Let's just glance at a couple real quickly. If you ask the question, why do you think there are 5 books? It's a very old tradition in the manuscripts themselves that divide the Psalms in major collections. And even on your Bible app, probably it says, what does it say at the very beginning of Psalm 111, way at the very, very top? It probably should say, yours says Book 1. Anybody else say Book 1?
Book 1.
Very good. That's it. That actually is in the manuscripts, if I recall. That's right. So it's actually in the title. So if you go to Psalm 41, just go ahead a little bit to Psalm 41, and you'll see something a little bit different. Psalm 42, rather. What does it say above Psalm 42? Book 2. See, there's a theme. See, you don't need any PhDs. Isn't that clever? Sorry, you just got to read it. These are massive collections, and inside of the Psalms, there are all kinds of different kinds of psalms, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. There are various kinds of psalms. Songs, like today, I'll talk about the different kinds. Psalms typically have titles, and out of 150 psalms, 116 have titles, which is a lot. And they certainly link the psalms together thematically. Usually that title in Hebrew is the first line of the psalm itself. By the way, that's where we get the first titles of the Old Testament books themselves. In Hebrew, the first word is bereit, and it means created. That's what the Hebrews call Genesis, bereit. But we use the Latin version of it for Genesis from the Greek word geneo, which means origin. And so actually in Hebrew, the titles come from the first word of the book itself. Well, in the Psalms similarly. So whatever the first line is, that's where they get the first title. In your English translations, oftentimes that might be brought out by the Bible. And some have titles, songs of ascent, probably like in Psalm 120. Probably means, Dennis, those songs as they went up to Jerusalem, up the hill, Psalm of Ascent. That is, pilgrim time, baby, I see the temple, let's start singing, Kumbaya or whatever. Psalm of Love or My Beloved in Psalm 45. Let me give these tips typically come from me, and the book might not emphasize this. The common expression Psalm of David that you'll see often in the Psalms, and it's typically assumed in churches when we say, well, who wrote, let's see what King David says in Psalm 24 or 46, and he did it. In Hebrew, actually, it's ambiguous. We call the genitive case. It could be the Psalm of David, and that can mean it is Psalm of David or David's Psalm. But in Hebrew, it could be all kinds of things, and I say this here in the tip. It could mean he authored it. It could mean it's dedicated to him. It could mean it's about him, or that has a Davidic style, like saying the book of Moses. It does not mean in Hebrew necessarily Moses wrote it. Because in Hebrew, everything I just said applies to the book of Moses. Attributed to him, given in his honor, in his style. The problem is the language itself was our problem, but it's just ambiguous. There's some polyvalence of meaning, what they'll call it. So we should not assume King David wrote every single psalm. You might believe that, but my next question is, why do you think that? Because the Psalms don't tell us he wrote every psalm. There are certain psalms that do seem very suggestive that he did because they reference very particular historical things in the Psalms. Secondly, there's no reason at all to assume that David would have never written any psalms. That's not a crazy idea that he wrote hymns based on what we have in the Old Testament narratives that talk about him being able to play the harp. So historians don't say, this is crazy. They might say, well, sure, he probably wrote some. There's nothing wrong, but we probably should not assume he wrote all of them. There's just no reason to think that. So they're hymns. Okay, number 2, Psalms talk primarily to God and about God. That is very important. That's why I italicize those words, to God and about God. And they represent the theology of the author, not necessarily God himself, but the theology of the author. Theology just means the study of God. I want you to get used to that word in Christianity, theology or theological, that which pertains to God. They are not intended to teach doctrine or moral behavior. Ever. No Jew read the Psalms and go, oh, that's a good point. I ought to go do that in my life too. As far as we know, as far as we have evidence. That's not how they used it. They help the Jews express feelings of joy, sorrow, sadness, hatred, whatever. And this is very common amongst skeptics and atheists, with whom I deal more often than not, and that is they read the Psalms and think they're moral. They read the wrong genre. They think they're laws or wisdom literature, so it's intended to teach moral Aesop's fables. And the moral of the story is, go do X. That's not how we should read it at all. They're hymns. John Wesley and his brother Charles particularly wrote tons and tons and tons of hymns. Well, that was based on his theology, so there's Wesleyan theology throughout. Disciples of Christ have some hymns. Baptists have hymns. Church of Christ. So it's just based, the person who writes it demonstrates the theology. Remember the old school Polaroids, the picture came out of the bottom and you flipped it, whatever? Well, that's what Psalms are. They're Polaroid pictures of a snapshot in history of that author's theological view. They append it, he or she, probably a he usually. And this can have horrible consequences. If a Christian thinks the Psalms are written in order to give moral instruction, what do we do about Psalm 137, 8-9? Can you read that for me? Psalm 137, 8-9.
How blessed will be the one who seizes and dashes your little ones against the rock.
And this is where skeptics and atheists say, see, that's the kind of God, good, loving God you have. How does it help us if we realize that Psalms are not moral commandments for people, but instead that the context, historical context, is that the psalmist is agonizing over the recent destruction of Jerusalem by Babylonians. The psalmist just saw Jerusalem fall, probably all his family destroyed, his slavery taken off to exile, and he pens a song to God, praising God, would ask him to do something about it. And he says, I'll be so happy when you get what's coming to you, vengeance. Let's see what happened to us happen to you. Well, that's not a sermon. This isn't Jesus talking. This is the psalmist crying out and so forth. Does that sink in more? I want to make sure that sinks in, because I'm trying to help you here, because so many times I've heard people have developed real bad theology based on a psalmist emotion in the time. Sometimes a psalmist feel like God has completely abandoned them. Sometimes he feels afraid and so forth, this next bullet point. And they really can help us express our feelings. Psalm 138, Psalm 140 about fear and intimidation. Psalms are incredible to help us express emotion. They're really good. Psalms are really good to journal with sometimes. If you're going through a hard time, read them. If you're real happy, read the Psalms and man, that's good. If you haven't noticed yet, even in the bulletin for the traditional service and also in the PowerPoint otherwise, I have certain Bible verses at the top of all the order of service on purpose, mostly from the Psalms, because it's about praising and joy. The idea is that when we read it, I'm trying to get us in that mindset that I'm thankful, I'm happy for Him. And so that's from the Psalms. They help us there. Psalms demonstrate that you can demonstrate and feel whatever feeling you have and want toward God. A lot of Christians grew up in households and churches where it was bad. to be upset with God, be angry with Him, doubt Him, be scared. And I always say, well, then I don't know what to do with the Psalms, because they are full of the gambit of emotion.
So you take your anger out on God instead of the person next to you.
Take my anger out on God instead of the person next to you, yeah. And I would dare say there are times when that's appropriate to take anger out. That is, I'm mad that you didn't do what you said you would, or when I thought you would, or maybe I misunderstood. That's a normal emotion versus, taking it out on people all the time. Other times, we should take it out on the person, not take it out. I mean, the anger should be directed toward them. If I can piggyback that a little bit, one of the most common emotional states for those who have been victimized by people, if they've been hurt, if they've been taken advantage of in any way, it's very common for them to get very, very, very angry at God for why X, Y, Z happened. And the answer always is, well, God didn't make that happen. The free willed individual did it to you. So there, the appropriate, in other words, kind of works both ways. Sometimes people quickly go to God and blame Him for things that maybe we thought God in a biblical promise, like I thought you were going to show up, and I get it. But then plenty of times we get mad at God, well, it doesn't make sense at all to get mad at Him. Logically, emotionally it makes sense because a bunch of other psychological reasons. But the Psalms helps to demonstrate we can get mad at Him. I love it. This sounds maybe sadistic, but I love it when the psalmists say so many times, God, why are you silent? Are you asleep? And by the little footnote here, that in the ancient people talk that way about their gods, other gods, Canaanite gods, or the gods being asleep. So they draw upon that imagery in the common ethos environment to say, God, why are you asleep? So many times I've thought that God hasn't shown up or rescued when I thought He would. And that's my deal, but I thought He would. And I'm like, what's your problem? Now, I know God's not asleep, but boy, I sure tell Him. Or why does it feel like that way? So the psalmist said that many times. Many times. So they talk to God about God. They're not speaking for God. They're speaking to God and about God, not for God. These are not sermons. They're psalms. They're poems. Number 3, the genre of a psalm is a poem. It is a poem. And Hebrew poetry is almost entirely concerned with emotional language, most like it is today in English. It appeals to feelings, uses metaphors and similes. It's important not to put too much emphasis upon particular words or phrases. Don't over-exegete the Psalms. Ask the question, what is the language trying to express? Let's go to Psalm 19, 1 and 2. Very, very common technique in poems, no matter where they are in the Bible, is called synonymous parallelism. In Psalm 19, which is an incredibly, I think, awesome poem about how awesome God's law is. And if those astute followers of the Bible will notice that if you have a devotional that I wrote designed for the church, the little handouts you make your sermon notes in, on the cover of that book is it's from Psalm 19. Psalm 19. Look at Psalm 19, 1 and 2. Look at it says, to the choir master. That's in the manuscripts. So, and it says things like, a psalm of David. Now, there's a lot of I think I have later on. There's little things, notes given all over the place that maybe I don't have that later on. There's little notes in the Psalms oftentimes. We just don't know what they mean. And sometimes we think it might mean refrain. Like the word Selah. Selah, have you seen it before? There was a Christian group called Selah. And I don't mean this mean, but it is kind of funny to me. We have no idea what Selah means. No idea at all what it means. No Hebrew lexicographer has any clue what it means. But everybody in the church assumes they know what it means. I've seen all kinds of t-shirts, Selah, rest in God's grace, and Selah, blah, blah, blah. And I always ask the person with the t-shirt, Selah, what's that mean? Yeah, it means rest.
It means
It means a guitarist? Yeah. Lead guitarist. Oh, and so I ask him, what do you think? Yeah. I go, where'd you read that? Well, I heard from some book. I mean, the point is, we don't know. But they're in the Psalms all the time. It could mean pause. It could mean repeat. It could mean play that little ditty that we do when we do this song. We just don't know. There are things like that oftentimes, like to the choir master. Sometimes it'll say, to the tune of blank. So they knew what it was. We've lost it completely. But look at Psalm 19, 1 and 2. The heavens declare the glory of God. I did this on, common one. And the sky above proclaims His handiwork, or the sky above. Day to day pours out speech, and night to night reveals knowledge. You see that there in 1 and 2? Well, look in verse 1 alone. There's 2 phrases. Heavens declare the glory of God, the sky above proclaims His handiwork. Because it is a poem, what I'm suggesting, and most interpreters, is you don't over-exegete verse 1. And many pastors love to do that because they're trying to preach something, I guess. But it declares the glory of God. But it's not done. It's not done. Look at the sky. It proclaims it's the same daggum thing. It means the same thing. It's called synonymous parallelism. It's the same point, just said a different way. Some people like to say it's amplified. Well, sometimes it seems to be. Typically, it's just another way to say it. Verse 2, that's what? That's what poetry is, brother. That's right. Day to day pours out speech, night to night reveals knowledge. That's the same thing. That's very common in the Psalms to just repeat it side by side. And so typically don't try to find a deeper, more profound meaning in a repetition of the sentiment. Try not to look for some deeper, now I know really what he means. Again, and look on top of page 24, it's important not to read the instructive morality or theological doctrines. Look at Psalm 51. This is a real common psalm that's used inappropriately. We could give a lot of these, I guess. In Psalm 51, we have one of the most well-known psalms, besides probably Psalm 23 in the whole Bible. Psalm 51, to the choir master, a psalm of David, when Nathan the prophet went to him after he had gone into Bathsheba. So that's early in the manuscript, so this shows up. And either the psalmist thought that's where it went, or this really is a good historical record of what this is referencing. We're not sure, but this is a very old tradition. Have mercy on me, O God, according to your steadfast love, according to your abundant mercy, blot out my transgression. Go down to verse 5. Behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me. Now, many times that exact verse, when David is talking here, is used to support the fact that we're born sinful. Yeah, and they'll use the term original sin. They also use Romans 5 there, but they'll say, see, look at here. If this is poetry, if that's how the genre is supposed to be understood, we should not read it that way, because it's not trying to preach a sermon or teach doctrine. And that's why the authors say on the top of 24 here, it's not trying to establish that his conception was sinful, or that all conceptions are sinful, or that his mother was a sinner by getting pregnant, or that original sin applies to unborn children, or anything like that. The psalmist is employing poetic hyperbole. He's wallowing in his guilt and sin. I'm such a dirty, rotten wretch. I've been a sinner forever. That's it. It's hyperbole. It's just I ruined it. I wrecked it. And now you might, Dave, no, because the Bible says from my birth, and even if that's what it quote unquote means, if that's the quote clear meaning of the text, even if that's what it is, all it would therefore mean is David thinks he was born in sin. At most that's what you would say. At absolute most. And I think even that's wrong. I don't think David really thought that. I think he's just saying, man, I blew it. I raped this woman, had her husband killed. This is horrible. So that's a perfect example where I would never preach a sermon and teach a lesson on, therefore, I wouldn't read this and go, therefore, you should do X, Y, Z. I would say, therefore, demonstrate how much remorse he has, how badly he feels for the sin. Does that make sense? You have any questions or comments from me? All right, let's start with the Psalms. This is usually pretty quick here, but maybe we'll read some. This is good. Scholars they're divided on a lot of things. But one of the things Old Testament scholars have never concurred upon, and that is how many kinds of Psalms are there. Some say 3, some say 5, some 7, some 10. And Stewart, the Old Testament specialist, who's the co-author of this book, he uses the 7 one. And so there you go. We'll just use this 7. But again, scholars divided exactly how to divide them up. But we know there are different ones. I think 7's cool, but I don't really care that much, quite frankly. But if you'll look closely, there's a pattern and a structure that is recognizable. If you read your Psalms, like modern songs typically have a verse, chorus, chorus. Or if it's a modern praise song, it's a verse, chorus, refrain, chorus, guitar solo, chorus, verse, chorus. Repeat it, this time for Jesus, chorus, and I'm just kidding. So there's a recognizable, when everybody goes down to write a song, they know kind of how the routine is. But really, most songs have that today, right? Verse, chorus, blah. Well, that's how it is in the ancient Psalms, because they're writing a genre. They know how to write them. The lament is the largest group of Psalms. Whatever you call these, or different words scholars use, we'll say it this way, lament. Anger, sorrow, pain, those kind of, might say, negative emotions. If you have Psalm 51 open, let's just stay close by and go back to 44. Psalm 44. Here's a great example of a lament psalm. He says to the choir master, a masel of the songs of Korah. Now look at your footnote there. Do you have a footnote under maskil? Maskil. A footnote, a maskil of the sons of Korah. Do you have a footnote on a maskil?
Probably literary or musical term.
Probably a literary and musical term. What's another way of saying that is? We don't have a clue what in the world that means. That's like saying it's probably a word. Yes, it's a word. But so we don't have a clue. These words only show up in these contexts. It's called a hapax legomenon. It's when the word shows up nowhere else in the Bible. So we can't compare it and contrast it and go, it probably comes from this word. And the problem is we just get lost, especially if it doesn't show up in other ancient literature. Well, then we just don't know. So I agree, it probably is a literary or musical term. Verse 1, O God, we have heard with our ears, our fathers have told us what deeds you performed in their days, in the days of old. You with your own hand drove out the nations, but them you planted. You afflicted the peoples, but them you set free. And he goes on for a while. Look at verse 4. You are my king, O God, ordained salvation for Jacob. Through we push down our foes, through your name we tread down those who rise up against us. Verse 9. But you have rejected us and disgraced us, and have not gone out with our armies. You have made us turn back from the foe, and those who hate us who have gotten spoil. You have made us like sheep for slaughter, and have scattered us among the nations. You sold your people for a trifle, demand no high price for them. Here, of course, he's probably referencing the Babylonian exile. But this long psalm of lament is, man, God, you blew it. You blew it. You've been so good a long time ago, but recently, you didn't give a rip what happened to us. And so we look at these contexts here in the middle of page 24. That's the pattern typically. There's some cry of help, some cataloging of distress, usually sickness or fear of death, or sin, forgiveness, trouble with enemies. Then there's some cry of redress. He's going to show up. He's going to know. I know it. And then sometimes at the very end, there's some kind of vow or offering to sing praises. Like, it's kind of like bartering with God. If you do this and that, and then... So you see that theme there? I don't know how much you want to go. Like Psalm 3 is a great lament psalm. Psalm 3. Psalm 3, Psalm of David, when he fled from Absalom, his son. O Lord, how many are my foes? Many are rising against me. Many are saying of my soul, there is no salvation for him in God. See, that's the problem. But you, O Lord, are a shield about me, my glory and the lifter of my head. I cried aloud to the Lord, and he answered me from his holy hill. So there's some kind of, I know you're not going to blow it. I know you're not going to fail me. And he goes down to verse 7, Arise, O Lord, save me, my God. And it goes down to verse 8, Salvation belongs to Yahweh, your blessing be on your people. So sometimes there's an ending of hope. So we'll see that all the time. Lament is all over the place.
You skipped the Selah.
Yes, I skipped them. Oh, that sure did. Look at there. And in verse 2, Selah. And verse 4, Selah. Which clearly mean we don't have a clue. Yeah, we don't know. That's right. I don't know what that means. That's lament. So it tells me that people were sad a lot when they wrote a song. It's an old country song. If you flip it backwards, you get your truck back and your dog back and your beer back. The record player. Okay, number 2, Thanksgiving songs. Anything, that's an easiest one. Express gratitude, joy. 18, 30, 32, 65, 67, there's a bunch of them. I personally wish they would take all these categories and make them a nice little order. Like book 1 would be the book of sorrow. Book 2 psalm would be, I wish they had categories like that. But they didn't ask my opinion when they wrote this a long, long time ago. So Thanksgiving psalms, let's go ahead to praise psalms. These are very similar. Sometimes people conflate these together, Thanksgiving and praise, but they show gratitude and joy for general things. Like in Psalm 8, God is the creator of all things. I don't know if you have your Bible open still. In Psalm 8, this is a classic one. A very old tune was done to this one. Not very old, but. To the choir master, according to this getteth. Footnote says, getteth. Probably a musical liturgical term. Probably so. I think you're probably right. We have no clue what it means. But according to the getteth, I think it would mean according to a tune, a common tune. That's another thing I noticed about disciples of Christ, that almost 99% of the time when I recognize the tune, y'all change the words. And Elaine sings the real lyrics in my ear for half the song. I got it. Not the.
Now we know the Baptist, the Methodist, and we're learning the
Disciples of Christ. Yeah, they all have their favorites.
They all have
Yeah, different tunes they do. They rewrite them. No, I was teasing when I said the real words. That was to be a joke. But anyway, yeah, the different ones. Yeah, the ones I grew up hearing.
It says on the beginning, so maybe it's an instrument.
Oh, this says on?
Mine does.
Maybe it's because of the Hebrew. Huh. O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. You have sent your glory above the heavens. Out of the mouth of babes and infants, you have established strength. That's a general, that goes on and on about praise. You've done something great. Then there are psalms we call them salvation history or historical ones. That's when God's done something very particular among the people. Like in Psalm 78. Let's look at least just one of these. Psalm 78. These can be a little bit easier to date, sometimes what occurred at least. Yeah, long. Let's look in verse 5. This is praising a specific thing. Psalm 78:5. He established a testimony to Jacob, or Yaakov, and appointed a law in Israel, which he commanded our fathers to teach to their children, that the next generation might know them, the children yet unborn, and arise and tell them to their children, so that they should set their hope in God, and not forget the works of God, but keep his commandments. Of course, that's a direct allusion to Deuteronomy 6:5. He goes on, and then Ephraimites armed with his bow in verse 9. He goes on and on and on. It's basically a big, fat, long history of Israel. So imagine standing up and saying, in 1776, George Washington, and you tell a long story about the history of America. These kind of psalms do these kinds of things. The bottom page, 24. Various psalms deal with renewing the covenant. We call these, he calls them celebration and affirmation. Or the royal psalms, we've got to look at, or psalms that celebrate Jerusalem. You can see those all over the place. Let me see if one of these. Yeah, let's go to Psalm 46. I'm trying to give you some examples of this last one, psalms that celebrate Jerusalem. One is because these can be quite difficult to apply today, but nevertheless they're there because they sure were happy about them. In Psalm 46, we have, to the choir master of the sons of Korah, according to the Alamoth, a song. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth gives way, though the mountains be moved into the heart of the sea, though the waters roar and foam, the mountains tremble at his swelling. There's a river whose streams make glad the city of God, that means Jerusalem, the holy habitation of the Most High. God is in the midst of her, she shall not be moved. God will help her when morning dawns. The nations rage, the kingdoms totter, he utters his voice, the earth melts. The Yahweh of hosts is with us. God of Jacob is our fortress. Selah. Come, behold the works of Yahweh, how he has brought desolation on the earth. He makes war cease to the end of the earth. He breaks the bow and shatters the spear. He burns the chariots with fire. Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. Yahweh of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. Now, I picked that one. You should have recognized a couple verses that are very, very popular, particularly verse 10. In context of the psalm, of what is God, of the psalmist speaking, when he says to be still and know that I'm God. What's the context? In context, what does it mean to be still and know that I'm God? Good, yeah, rest in his sovereignty that no matter what happens, that's right. What seems to be going on, what is he praising in the psalm? He's praising God, that God is going to make sure that what never happens. Or not what never happens, that who's strong, like in verse 7 and in verse 11. He protect Israel, yeah. So the God of Jacob, the house of Jacob, is our fortress. And this, way up in the verse 4 and 5, this holy city, verse 5, shall not be moved. The kingdoms rage, they go crazy. The point is, he's going to establish and protect Israel, protect Jerusalem in particular. And that plays off of probably some themes throughout, like 2 Samuel and other places, that establishes Zion, or Jerusalem to be established forever. And there was a tradition in Jewish theology that God would in fact protect Jerusalem forever. He wouldn't let it fall at all. Well, it did a few times, but there is some Jewish theology all through the Psalms to do that. And I'm not saying that God isn't God, but in verse 10, when the psalmist is saying that, he doesn't mean, he's not talking about when you can't pay your bills. He's not talking about when you've had a bad day and you lost your car keys. He's telling the people in Jerusalem, Israel himself, calm down. Around us, the nation's going to rage, but God's going to protect us here. Now, before you quit Christianity, I'm not saying you shouldn't have peace. I just think there are other Bible verses that really would demonstrate a lot better. Though I think it's still okay to use the quote this verse, and he's applying it again to God and about God, but in context he's referencing something else. But there are psalms that celebrate wisdom psalms, and you might say trust psalms, but again you might leave those with praise songs. I'll say one quick word about this, about the word hate. You'll find this in the Bible and certainly in the Psalms. You hate this, you hate that, oh God, you hate this. It can mean despise, an emotional vitriol. It can mean that, but typically it's something like to be unwilling or unable to put up with, or shortly, reject. Where love can mean accept, hate can mean reject. It is a strong word, but the emphasis seems typically to be upon the fact that he's not chosen it, not an emotional or psychological state of vitriol or disdain. So when you hear that and God had hated the Assyrians or something like that, I said, man, he's sure I thought he was loving. But Paul and Jews use this all the time. Israel, Jacob he loved, Esau he loved, Jacob he. I'm going backwards. Who did he love and hate? Jacob, right? I got it right. Yeah, Yaakov. And he hated the other. And Paul says that, of course, in Romans 9 through 11. But they represent the people groups. But again, most interpreters don't think he means that God literally went, he's just so, but rather he rejected one and got the other. It's just a poetic way of saying it. Jesus says, if you don't hate your mother and father and your brothers and sisters, you cannot be my disciple. Most New Testament interpreters don't think he really meant you got to see him go, and I'm going to punch him in the face. It's reject him. That is when it comes to that, but see, that's powerful vocabulary. Hating your mother and father is better than saying, if you don't value my opinion more than theirs, you're going to remember it if he said, what I think he did say, which is, if you don't hate your parents, I'm going to remember that a lot more than you got to make sure you choose me over them. And it scores that point better. It's a poetic hyperbole.